Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video, I'm going to provide a broad overview of Aeldari lore. We will discuss very generally who the Eldar are, how they evolved conceptually from the early days of the game, and their role in the current 40k setting. I'll talk about their history, their mythology, and the fundamentals of the 5 or 6 different Aeldari factions who comprise the space elf populations of the 41st millennium. We will, however, stop short of discussing particular named craft worlds in any detail, as that will be the focus of another video. And this one is going to be pretty long as it is. Okay, let's do the thing. I think the best way to make sense of what the Aeldari are in the 40k setting is to zoom out to 30,000 feet and to look at where they came from. The first edition of the 40k tabletop game was published back in 1987, and it was partially just like a science fiction version of the 1983 flagship product, Warhammer Fantasy Battles, which was like the big GW thing back in the day. And that was a pseudo-medieval Tolkien-esque war game in which elves and dwarves and orcs and an empire of man battled one another for control of the old world. And first edition 40k, which was called Rogue Trader, began by just transporting all of those playable races into the grim darkness of a hyperbolic heavy metal future. And incidentally, if you're interested in a deep dive on the influences that shaped the development of 40k, I have a video about that. It's one of my favorite pieces of content I've ever created. I'm going to link it in the video description. But let's do Space Elves. Okay, Space Elves. 40k Space Elves, which were simply known as Eldar for the first several editions of the game, began as a science fiction version of the elves from The Lord of the Rings. And this is demonstrable. The first people who wrote rules for them and lore for them and designed the models talked about this as a specific influence. Like the elves of Middle-earth, the Aeldari are a diminished civilization, watching as mankind rises to fill the power vacuum created by the decline of the elves. And just as the elves of Middle-earth are exponentially more advanced in their knowledge of just about everything than the kingdoms of men, so too the Aeldari wield technology that is largely incomprehensible to even the greatest minds in the Imperium of Man, whose denizens space elves derisively refer to as Monkai, or just monkey. Whereas Tolkien's elves were all to varying degrees inherently magical, the Eldar of the 40k setting are all to varying degrees psychically gifted, manipulating the skeins of fate with ritual, prophecy, and good old-fashioned political meddling, kind of like Tolkien's elves. Elrond was a big meddler. Other commonalities with Tolkien's pointy-eared forest dwellers include inhuman grace, aristocratic bearing, unimaginably long lifespans, and a near-complete absence of right angles in their curvy Art Nouveau-esque architecture. The Aeldari are 40k's overly emotional, enigmatic, magical posh kids who deal with big feelings by embracing extreme lifestyles. Everything else more or less flows from that, but let's talk about where they come from in the lore rather than their genesis from a design perspective. Like many of the races in the 40k universe, the Aeldari were created by the Old Ones, tens of millions of years before the current setting. The Old Ones were a species of allegedly benevolent space reptiles who may have been the first star-faring civilization in the lore. They were arguably the most technologically advanced race to ever have existed in the 40k IP, not only seeding numerous planets with life, but also constructing the Webway, an unimaginably vast network of bright psychic pathways that operate as a sort of space between spaces, existing neither in the warp nor in real space, but connecting countless locations throughout the galaxy and perhaps beyond. The Webway is also, incidentally, central to the foundational 40k origin story, as the Emperor of Mankind had control of an ancient Webway gate on Earth that was ultimately used as a point of entry for Horus's demon-corrupted space mutants in their assault during the final days of the Siege of Terra. But that's Monkai stuff for another day or other content creators. These days, the Webway is the primary method Eldar use to get around rather than the faster-than-light travel used by most other species. Aeldari actually only have sublight ships. They use the Webway. It's also safer for a variety of reasons. Okay, so I mentioned the warp a moment ago, which is another concept that I want to address for listeners who are totally new to the setting, because it's super integral and really confusing if it's not been explained. The warp is another dimension that is physically separate from, but is probably in some ways generated by real space. It doesn't have stable spatial locations or even a timeline that runs concurrent with our own. Instead, it's a vast ocean of psychic energy that is in some ineffable way shaped and perhaps even generated by the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors of all the sentient beings in the galaxy. It's kind of like an inversion of Plato's realm of forms, if you're familiar with that, where instead of physical reality being generated by some non-physical truth outside of space-time, it's the other way around. That is, because there are trillions of conscious beings dreaming, loving, hating, growing, changing, and dying, there's a dimension of raw, mercurial, psycho-emotional energy pounding against real space like an ocean, and in places eroding the natural and mathematical laws of real space and bleeding into it like a stain on the fabric of reality. And there are things in that ocean that it is generally best not to encounter. Manifestations of growth, desire, change, rage, things with memories and personalities that are regarded as demons in the 40K universe, many of which are in some way connected to one of the four chaos gods, warp entities that may or may not themselves be conscious beings, but certainly behave like they're conscious beings when they are inhabiting or encountering inhabitants of real space. Nearly every sentient being in the 40K universe has some kind of resonance in the warp, and those resonances, for all intents and purposes, are their souls. Each soul is a personal essence that for at least some period of time persists in the warp even after the death of the individual. And the Aeldari are unique in that their souls burn much more brightly in the warp, that is, have much greater resonance than the souls of other species. And either as a result of or as a cause of this fact, the Eldar all have unusually intense emotions and psychic gifts that allow the most talented among them to use the warp to see the future or manipulate real space in a variety of ways that range from telepathy and battle magic to shockingly impressive arts and crafts projects. In some way, everything the Eldar make is connected to their psychic gifts, with the exception of one subgroup of Eldar we're going to talk about later, but most of them. For example, one of the most common building materials used by space elves is a psychotechnical compound called wraithbone, which can be shaped with warp energy to create buildings, ships, armor, jewelry, even war machines that can only be piloted by the dead. For most Eldar, using warp energy to manipulate real space is part of their very nature. So what makes space elves so special? Why do they get to be so magical and nobody else is quite so magical? Well, 60 million years ago, the old ones created the Aeldari with these psychic gifts specifically so that they could defeat the Catan or the Satan, depending on who you ask, a race of star-eating super aliens that were threatening to annihilate the galaxy. With the help of their servant race, the Necrons, which in the current 40K timeline are pseudo-Egyptian space skeletons. The details are a bit shady here, but our best guess is that the old ones were very nearly exterminated during this conflict, or just about exterminated, and nevertheless, their creation, the Aeldari, were eventually victorious against the Catan, or Satan. Exactly how all this went down is less than clear, and we have to do a little speculating because 40K lore is full of gaps and contradictions, but it seems that the ancient Aeldari either intentionally or unintentionally brought about the existence of an entire pantheon of gods, which were and are essentially demons of the warp that may or may not have been weapons used against the Catan. But at some point during the millennia or eons that followed the war for which they were created, the Aeldari became alienated from the few remaining old ones and instead developed a relationship with the warp entities whom they venerated as gods, eventually coming to regard those entities as their own creators, not the other way around. The Eldar came to believe that they were all the children of Isha, a goddess of love and fertility and natural bounty, who coupled with Kurnos, the god of the hunt, to produce the Aeldari. But there were a bunch of other gods besides, each of whom bestowed gifts on Isha's children. Azurian, the Phoenix King, the lord of the pantheon, made the Eldar wise and acted as a lawgiver, while Lilith, the goddess of dreams, gave the Eldar joy, and Vol, the smith god, provided the means to realize that joy through creation, and Cain, the god of warfare, gave them fiery anger that they would need to defend themselves from harm, and Kegarak, the trickster god, gifted them with laughter, and so on. There are others. And it's quite possible that the gods themselves believed the stories that the Eldari told about them, about who created whom and what's going on here. As it still is not absolutely clear in the 40K setting to what degree warp entities are independent of the psycho-emotional energy of the sentient beings who brought them into existence in the first place. Or alternatively, maybe demons of the warp don't really even understand the concept of truth in quite the same way that we do. But the point is that even if the reality is that the first Eldar in some way created the gods, not the other way around, it doesn't follow from that the gods are lying or intentionally deceiving the Eldari in embracing the stories that the Eldar tell about them. I am not going to try to cover all of those stories here. The details of space elf mythology are legion, but there is a central story that I feel like I should summarize because it contains the seeds of a number of concepts that are important in the current 40K setting. And the tale goes as follows, roughly. Lilith, the goddess of dreams, predicted that the Eldari would eventually cause Cain's destruction. Remember, he's the god of war, which is turned true in a sense. It turns out to have been true, as we'll see much later on, but not necessarily how any of the gods would have thought. So Cain attempted to prevent this eventuality with a complete space elf genocide, which was only halted when Isha petitioned Azurian to save her children. Azurian did so by shutting down travel between real space and the warp, so that Cain could not continue his bloody extermination, but neither could the Eldari have access to their gods after this time the way that they once did. And I just think it's a curious twist that this kind of mirrors quite a few real-world religious traditions, which often include some notion of an ancient time when human beings could encounter divinity directly, walking in a garden or whatever, and then later they can only do so in whirlwinds and burning bushes, and then eventually only in dreams and visions. The realm of the gods is always retreating from us in most ancient belief systems, and I like how 40K draws on, so many cool real bits of history and literature and art. Anyway, Azurian decreed that from here on, the Eldari were on their own. None of the gods would be permitted to communicate further with them, nor vice versa. But Isha developed a serious case of empty nest syndrome and asked Vol to help her create artifacts or create for her artifacts that would enable her children to call her now and then so that she and Kurnos could, make an occasional mortgage payment or provide unsolicited romantic advice to their adult children. Vol consented and crafted the first spirit stones, which were somehow distributed to the Eldari despite the newly established rift between the dimensions. It's not quite clear if you couldn't go in between how this happened, but it happened. Long story short, I know this doesn't sound short, but this is short. Long story short, Isha and Kurnos got caught breaking Azurian's rules, so the Phoenix King let Cain abduct and torture them unspeakably until Vol offered to make Cain 100 divinely crafted super swords in exchange for releasing his prisoners, and Cain agreed, giving Vol a year to deliver the weapons. But when the time was up, Vol, was one sword short. So he swapped in a regular space elf blade and hoped that his psychopathic brother wouldn't notice. Well, he noticed. And this triggered a civil war between the gods called the War in Heaven that ended with Cain kicking Vol's ass and chaining him to his own anvil before slaughtering Slaanesh, the greatest mortal Eldari hero. I mean, the Eldar were kind of immortal. The greatest Eldari hero in single combat, despite Slaanesh having a badass sword called Ynnari, shards of which have been artifact weapons in several editions of the tabletop game. After that, Azurian made everyone stop fighting, but Cain's hand became perpetually gory with Eldenash's blood, which is how the war god came to be known as Kala Mensha Cain, or Bloody-Handed Cain, which is also the reason that the avatar model you can run on the tabletop is sculpted with one grotesquely bloody hand. Yeah, that's actually the blood of the most famous Eldari hero, eternally dripping off his claw, not the viscera of some space marine he just squeezed until it popped like a wet egg. I also just want to mention that the War in Heaven refers both to the event in Aeldari mythology that I just told you about, as well as the war between the Old Ones and the Catan, which can be a bit confusing, but might be indicative of how the Eldari worldview differs from our own. About a year ago, Gav Thorpe, who is the author of most of the GW novels about the Eldari, as well as the lead writer on the 3rd edition Codex, was a guest on this channel. And he said that his own assumption is that most Eldari have a cyclical view of history, maybe all Eldari, such that the War in Heaven is something that has happened before and will happen again, and they perhaps use that same name to refer to a variety of conflicts with similar archetypal properties, which would make sense for a species that uses art and creativity rather than science and rationalism as the primary lens for navigating reality. In any event, both the conflict with the Catan and the messy intrigues between the Eldari gods are so many millions of years in the past, with reference to the current 40k setting, as to be unknowable even by the oldest and wisest Eldari seers. It's all mythology at this point. And what happened next is also a bit fuzzy in the details. But somewhere along the line, the Old Ones vanished entirely, the last few, leaving their most potent creation, the Eldari, as the undisputed masters of the galaxy. And the Space Elf Dominion grew into an empire that encompassed more than 10,000 worlds, and their technology became so advanced that they began to regard themselves as almost omnipotent. There's a book called Fist of Demetrius or something, in which some Imperials find this old piece of Eldari tech that theoretically could enable a user to make anything out of warp energy simply by thinking about it. So the level of technology that they had was like truly unimaginable. The denizens of the old empire became freer than any being had ever been, able to gratify any desire almost without labor of any kind, and to devote all of their time to learning, personal betterment, and entertainment. It's also important to note at this time that individual Eldari were functionally immortal, able to reincarnate after death, such that no threat or danger, not even death, could deter them from their heart's desire. I mean, pain sucks, I guess, but like ultimately they just didn't have as much on the line as species that experience death as mortals. So remember when you were a kid and you watched cartoons or played video games for so many hours in a row that eventually you had this like awful headache and you couldn't even enjoy it anymore, but you just didn't want to do your homework, so you just kept doing it? Well, you have to imagine many thousands of years of that feeling, I think, to start to grasp what it might have been like for space elves at the pinnacle of their civilization. They became so bored with their indulgences and their invulnerability that they became increasingly extreme in their depravity, turning to the exorbitant pursuit of pleasure involving wild orgies, mass murder, and cannibalism. And it didn't matter what they did to one another because their souls just walked the bright path through the warp to reincarnate and do it all again. And after thousands of years, during which trillions of Eldar just endlessly reenacted 2 Elves, 1 Cup, and the extended edition of Eldari Centipede, their collective depravity built up so much psychic resonance in the warp that a new chaos god exploded into being, tearing a hole in the veil between the immaterium, the warp, and real space, and sucking up all of the Eldari souls within light years of the 10,000 worlds that were the heart of the old Eldari Empire. So, enter Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, she who thirsts, the ultimate adversary of space elves everywhere. the newest god of the warp who wants to drown the galaxy in sex, drugs, and rock and roll until every sentient being is part of the same coked-up, pulsing pleasure blossom as though Hieronymus Bosch and Georgia O'Keeffe collaborated to create a demonic masterpiece. But there's more. Two other big existential changes occurred at the moment that Slaanesh was born. The first was the annihilation of the majority of the Aeldari gods, with the exception of Kegarak, who somehow escaped into the webway from the warp. He's a trickster god after all, so, tricks. And Cain, who was defeated and shattered, but not completely destroyed. As a result, there are still shards of Cain spread throughout the galaxy, which the surviving Aeldari occasionally rouse with blood sacrifice in times of great need, but we'll get to that later. There's also a story that Isha may still exist somewhere in the warp as a prisoner of Nurgle, the chaos god of disease, growth, and nature, being tortured eternally in his garden as he tries out new toxins on her divine body. But different sources conflict about this. Gav, for example, doesn't like it, but I think it's cool. The second big change is that with Slaanesh hungrily hoovering up all the Aeldari souls in the warp now, dead space elves no longer reincarnate. They just get turned into moist towelettes for the Prince of Pleasure, who obviously induced some pretty major cultural changes for the few Eldar who survived the Doom. And we'll get to those shortly. But first, a couple more fun facts about the Elf-pocalypse. If you Google 40K star map, you will see a large red stain that the Imperium of Man calls the Eye of Terror. This is a hole in reality created by the birth of Slaanesh, where the warp now overlaps real space, and the Eye of Terror occupies the region of space that was once the old Eldari Dominion. And it includes thousands of planets where demons now frolic in the ruins of ancient grandeur and play Are You Nervous with the Chaos Space Marine Trader Legions who set up home base there after the failed siege of Terra. The surviving Eldari now refer to these lost planets in the Eye of Terror as Crone Worlds, and occasionally mount expeditions to recover ancient artifacts and spirit stones, which we will discuss shortly, and discover the secrets of their great-great-grand elves. It's also worth noting that the birth of Slaanesh in M31 caused, 10,000 years before the current 40K setting, caused a psychic shockwave that blew away the warp storms that had isolated different human worlds from one another throughout the galaxy for thousands of years, clearing the way for the first galactic crusade, during which the Emperor of Mankind reunited most of the species, that is the species of man, under his banner, constructing the Imperium of Man. So just as the extinction of the old ones created a power vacuum that facilitated the rise of the Eldar, the near extinction of the Eldari made the rise of man possible. But of course, near extinction is not extinction. There are obviously still a number of space elves running around in M41, or they wouldn't be a playable faction in the current 40K setting. In fact, there are, broadly speaking, 5 different flavors of space elves still in existence, and also one pseudo-religious political party. And what primarily distinguishes these groups from one another is the different methods by which they survived the birth of Slaanesh and continue to endure. Now, the first of these is the Exodites, who are essentially space elves that decided they wanted to go back to being wood elves, especially if it meant they could ride on dinosaurs all day and stop compulsively checking social media. When the Eldari Empire was at its zenith, before the decline into debauchery and hedonism, there was a terraforming technology that was used to transform dead planets in distant parts of the galaxy into lush paradises called maiden worlds, with an eye towards eventual colonization at a time when the space elf population was exploding. However, the process of creating a maiden world took thousands of years, and by the time they were ready, most of the Eldari were too busy feasting on one another's flesh and finding new and creative ways to use corn on the cob to worry especially about teeming overpopulation. There were, however, exceptions, including the future Exodites, who were so disgusted by the cultural changes that resulted from technology so advanced that discomfort and labor became purely optional, that they decided to use the webway to relocate to maiden worlds and embrace a primitive existence of hunting, gathering, and perhaps farming, eschewing the technologies that made their civilization the most powerful in the universe had ever known, and relying instead on the daily demands of survival to keep from giving in to the Eldari capacity for hyperindulgence. Now, each of the Exodites worlds has its own webway gate that connects it to other locations through the hyperspace network, and many of these communities maintain relations, often involving trade with other Eldari groups, even up to the current moment in the 40K timeline. But the fate of the majority of their party animal cousins only strengthened the Exodites' conviction that rejecting technology in favor of daily toil was and is essential for their flourishing. And this is not to say that they have rejected technology entirely. And it's also important to remember that the Eldari don't think of technology as a separate category or endeavor the way human beings do. For space elves, all creation is artistic, and the Exodites have merely rejected those arts that eliminated the necessity of hard work and connection to the natural world. They still have, for example, weapons that put the standard loadout of an Imperial Guard regiment to shame, although they protect themselves as much by remaining hidden as by violence. It's not unheard of for the Imperium of Man to establish a research station or a colony for months or even years on some lush planet before realizing that it's already inhabited by the Eldari. And sometimes this realization comes only in the final moments before their own abrupt extermination as uninvited pests. But perhaps, I think, maybe like the best known lore about Exodites is that virtually all maiden worlds are home to species of gigantic reptiles, which the Exodites have learned to communicate with, ride, and sometimes trip out with heavy weaponry. I can't prove that the 1988 kids cartoon Dino Riders was the inspiration for this bizarre aspect of the lore, but it certainly doesn't seem unlikely, especially if you look at the ways in which 40K at the time was drawing so heavily on pop culture, especially like nerd pop culture. But before you get too excited, you should know that although GW provided rules for dinosaur riding Exodites back in 2nd edition, they have never actually produced models. At least not at the time that I'm making this video. There have been rumors for years that it's going to happen. But as a result, Eldari Exodites have been one of the most popular conversion projects, going all the way back to the very first Space Elf Codex in the 90s. People used to use Dark Elf Cold One riders. They used models from other games. There was even, I think, a pretty recent competition held by Games Workshop in which like one of the winning armies was an Eldari Exodite army. I've seen them at tournaments before. They look so amazing. Okay. Lastly, like all of the Eldar that survived the Doom, the Exodites have a method for avoiding consumption by Slaanesh when they die. Every Exodite world is spanned by a global network of obelisks and stone circles that include psychoactive crystals that can absorb the souls of individual Eldari when they die. And although each soul maintains its individuality after death, they also collectively form a vague consciousness that the Exodites refer to as a world soul. The most psychically gifted Exodites, their seers, commune with the world soul for guidance, which also leads to cultures of ancestor veneration, not unlike some of what exists on some of the craft worlds, which we're going to talk about next. The Craftworld Eldari, like the Exodites, fled the old Eldari Empire in the final millennia before the Doom. But unlike the Exodites, they did not flee to maiden worlds, nor did they seek liberty from hedonistic temptations by constantly challenging themselves. Instead, these Eldar, who call themselves the Asuryani, inhabit vast world ships, craft worlds, if you will, that they crafted, many of which are the size of Terran continents or small moons, with multiple biomes that can include forests and plains and even small oceans, forming self-sufficient ecosystems that easily provide for the needs of all who live there. There is no poverty and no material deprivation among the Asuryani. The ships themselves and virtually everything on them is composed of the psychoreactive material wraithbone, shaped and reshaped by elves called bone singers into cities, dwellings, engine chambers, and so on, whatever they need. Each craft world is a living thing, an unimaginably complex artifice permeated by a system called the Infinity Circuit, which is a shadowy consciousness composed of the souls of the hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of dead craft worlders who have formed the previous generations of the ship's inhabitants. And just as the Exodites rely on crystalline networks of obelisks to preserve their souls when they die, the Asuryani of the craft worlds each carry a soul stone, one of the tiers of Isha that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Aeldari mythology, that will absorb their souls at the moment of death to prevent consumption by she who thirsts. The surviving craft worlders recover the soul stones of their dead comrades when they fall in combat or whatever, and insert them into the Infinity Circuit, where they continue a ghostly existence as an individual consciousness while also acting as a small part of the collective psyche of the world ship itself. And although each craft world is an independent political entity with its own unique culture that might be wildly unlike those of other craft worlds, all the Asuryani have in common one philosophical commonality. Have in common a commonality. Do better, Brent. And that is a commitment to the Eldar path system, which is a way of living whereby each individual Eldari embraces for a time a particular function that in some sense dominates their identity and provides a focus for their natural emotional intensity. So, for example, those on the path of the artisan or the merchant or the botanist become, for the time that they are on that particular path, obsessively committed to that pursuit. Remember when you had like phases as a teenager and all you could think about was the thing? It's like that. But more so, it reshapes their personalities and it becomes the primary lens through which they experience the world, whatever that thing is at any given time. So those on the path of the seer, for example, devote themselves to developing their psychic gifts, while those on the path of the warrior join one of the aspect shrines and train constantly for war, embracing the remorseless will of Caleb and Shakane every time they don their helmets, and expressing one of the aspects of Kane's fury, each of which is a different martial art. When he was a guest on this channel, Gav Thorpe suggested that perhaps the Infinity Circuit of each craft world subconsciously influences the denizens of that particular craft world to pursue particular paths based on what the collective dead believe the craft world needs at any given time. So more teachers, more warriors, more seers, more horse dentists, or what have you. And there's no evidence of this in the official lore. I just love the idea conceptually, and because Gav is the most prolific official GW Space Elf author, I feel like he gets to say the thing, and maybe it's true. In any event, most Eldar walk paths over the course of their lifespans that are like myriad and different from one another. But sometimes an individual elf becomes so obsessed with a particular path that she is unable to ever separate herself from that particular pursuit, losing much of her previous self permanently to a single, all-encompassing obsession. And these individuals are highly valued for their unparalleled expertise in their chosen obsession, but they're also pitied for the self-destruction implied by such a turn. So, for example, those on the path of the warrior dedicate themselves to a particular martial art when they join an aspect shrine. So, like fire dragons learn to wield powerful fusion weapons, while striking scorpions become masters of concealment and ambush and close combat, and howling banshees get really good at yelling, and so on. But when one of these practitioners becomes completely consumed by this particular aspect of Kane, that practitioner becomes an exarch, a master warrior so obsessed with a particular aspect shrine that they can never again rejoin society as anything other than a highly disciplined psychopath savagely anticipating the next opportunity to kill the Craftworld's enemies. So they're both revered, but also perhaps pitied. You're not supposed to become lost on the path. Part of the whole path thing is you're supposed to avoid doing that. Similarly, all Farseers begin as Aeldari warlocks with a penchant for using wraithbone runes to read the skeins of fate, but become so obsessed with looking into possible futures that they can no longer turn away from prophecy and prognostication. Many Craftworlds are more or less ruled by a council of Farseers, which is a little bit shocking, right? Because you're not, theoretically, if everybody followed the path correctly, there would be no Farseers, and yet they're totally essential to Eldar society. But these are the contradictions of social systems, I guess. Farseers will often make decisions for the craft world based on concerns that might be hundreds or even thousands of years in the future, and can sometimes seem utterly bizarre, like abruptly deciding that the craft world should betray a close ally so that the ensuing military conflict will leave that ally strong enough to defeat an orc incursion that won't happen for like a century. And this sort of behavior has contributed to the widespread perception among other sentient races in the galaxy that the Eldar are enigmatic and untrustworthy. And although they wield great authority, Farseers face an additional consequence to having become lost on their particular path. And that is that their regular use of those wraithbone runes I mentioned to reflect possible futures, in some way, we don't know how, causes their own bodies to gradually crystallize until they have no choice but to travel to the Dome of Crystal Seers, which is a chamber that exists on every craft world, and it's filled with statuified Farseers, the bodies of ancient Farseers who have become permanent crystalline statues connected to the Infinity Circuit. And this eventually happens to every Farseer, even though it might take hundreds or thousands of years. But eventually, if they don't die in some other way first, they all turn into crystalline statues, and their spirits run around in the Infinity Circuit doing the normal Dead Elf Infinity Circuit stuff. Incidentally, if you're interested in learning more about how the path system shapes the psyches of individual Eldari, or you want to explore it, I wrote a short story about this, which I'll link in the video description. And like the other video I linked, it's one of my favorite pieces of content I've ever created for the channel. Okay, let's switch gears for just a moment and talk about how craft worlds mobilize for war, as Warhammer is a war game after all. And if you were considering playing Eldari on the tabletop, this is the aspect of the lore which will most directly influence your experience. I already mentioned that every craft world has individuals on the path of the warrior, and that each of these warriors is committed to a particular martial discipline associated with a particular aspect shrine. Nevertheless, the grim darkness of the 41st millennium is so grim, and the Eldari race is so depleted, that no craft world has enough dedicated warriors to entirely satisfy its martial needs. In fact, aspect warriors are by far the minority in most Eldari war hosts, which are primarily composed of Eldar guardians that are either fighting on foot or on jet bikes or operating vehicles or artillery platforms. And those guardians are further supported by powerful psychers like warlocks and farseers who enhance the prowess of their allies and cloud the minds of enemies and look into the future to provide preternatural guidance to their fellow battle elves. But it's guardians that make up the backbone of most war hosts. And guardians are just regular Eldari who take up arms in times of need, despite not actually being on the path of the warrior, although many of them may have at some time in the past, right? But currently are not. So when you look at an Eldar army, like most of those helmeted elves are weavers or dreamers. The path of the dreamer. You just do a lot of drugs and think about stuff, or horse dentists or whatever. Just doing their part for the craft world. Aspect warriors, on the other hand, compose the elite infantry. Some of whom may accompany one of the autarchs. Autarchs are Eldari generals who take up the path of command after having spent many lifetimes dedicated to the path of the warrior at a variety of aspect shrines. and there's an autarch who will command the entirety of the war host, and then there may be other autarchs who are commanding what are essentially battle groups. If the need is especially dire, Craftworlders also have the option of waking up their dead ancestors to fight on their behalf by pulling their soul stones out of the Infinity Circuit and inserting them into wraith constructs, which are ghostly mechs of various sizes that can wield powerful weapons and absorb considerable punishment. Wraiths are very durable. They're made of wraith bone. Nevertheless, this practice is frowned on as disturbing and ghoulish on most craft worlds. So ghost warriors are only used in times of terrible need. Also, sometimes after a battle, wraith constructs will just refuse to have their soul stones reinserted into the Infinity Circuit, which can get a bit awkward and really kill the vibe at like a Space Elf cocktail party, which is another reason not to rely on them except in times of direst need. There is an especially cool description in Guy Haley's Valdor novel of wraith constructs who have refused to return to the Infinity Circuit and just endlessly repeat, tragically, these little rituals of daily life, like malfunctioning automatons. It's actually my favorite part of the whole book. It's just such a great detail. Lastly, every craft world has a single shard of Kayla Menchikane, the shattered Eldari god of war and murder, that can be roused with a blood sacrifice to do battle. To awaken the Avatar, the Eldari must perform a ritual called the Court of the Young King, whereby an exarch is chosen. There's like one exarch who's chosen every year, and if they need to wake up the Avatar in that year, that the exarch is anointed and sent to a chamber where there's a stone statue of Kayla Menchikane, and the doors are shut, and there's this multi-day ritual that takes place outside. And I also like this because it was these like kings for a year. That was a thing in ancient Greece, and at the end of the year, you would kill them and plow their body into the land to encourage plants to grow. So this is another sort of like neat way in which the lore overlaps with real history, and it makes it feel, I don't know, more substantive or something. But anyway, eventually, after the ritual has been going on for long enough, the agonized screams of the chosen one subside, and the living molten form of the Avatar strides forth. Left hand still dripping with Eldenesh's blood, right hand wielding the Wailing Doom, which can be a sword or a spear or an axe, but regardless of what it looks like, it's maybe the most powerful single weapon in any craft world's arsenal. And nobody really knows, allegedly, exactly what happens to that exarch, whether that exarch is killed by the Avatar or somehow becomes the Avatar or some other thing. We don't know. Generally, though, the Asuryani only awaken the Avatar for significant or protracted conflicts, as its presence also disturbs their collective subconscious minds and stokes their own lust for battle and bloodshed, which is not something to mess around with when you just need to murder a few Monkai squatting on a maiden world. The stakes have to be high enough or the scale large enough to warrant significant disruption to the psyche of the craft world itself. I imagine it probably also affects the Infinity Circuit, right? Waking up a war god. Okay, so although the Asuryani are probably the single largest category of Eldari remaining in the galaxy, and therefore the greatest volume of remaining space elf military might, it's important to remember that they really are nothing more than a handful of microscopic shards of the old empire, a few individual petals blowing through the void of space where there were once fields of blossoms from horizon to horizon. There are only 5 major craft worlds and maybe a few dozen minor ones, maybe more. We don't know exactly how many, but it's not a tremendous number. Each craft world has its own customs, traditions, values, system of government, and even the major craft worlds don't always know one another's location, and they may not communicate directly for significant periods of time. Sometimes they even go to war with one another. So it's important to grasp that although the Asuryani might be the most populous of the surviving Eldari factions, they really aren't more than a handful of independent city-states without even a loose confederation. They have shifting alliances with one another, but they're not any sort of united political entity. And as I said earlier, the only fundamental similarity between the disparate craft worlds, beyond their shared history and their adherence to the path system, which is rigorous and demanding, is that they, are hoping to one day see the resurgence of space elf hegemony, which requires everybody to deny their inherent desires for excessive emotional satisfaction and lead sort of rigorous and austere lives, at least with reference to self-denial and focusing on a particular thing. And on all craft worlds, as a result, there are Eldar, especially the younger Eldar, who want opportunities to experience life without the strict rigidity imposed by a path, and therefore they voluntarily embrace exile for some period of time. Many of these outcasts become rangers, which are scouts and explorers who travel the stars and then sometimes return to help their craft worlds in times of need. But in general, they spend most of their time roaming the stars, like so many Australian kids running around Europe the year after they finish university. There's one craft world, Alatok, where rangers come and go more commonly, but for the most part, they're out in the galaxy kind of doing their own thing. But some of the outcasts decide that they want even more danger and excitement, but maybe less solitude than they can achieve as rangers. And so instead, they become pirates, which leads us to our third major category of remaining space elves, Corsairs. It's probably impossible to know just how many Corsair bands there are roaming the galaxy, but the number is considerable. And they range from a single ship with maybe a dozen crew members performing hit-and-run operations against Imperial supply lines, while others are small fleets of perhaps dozens of ships and hundreds of Aeldari reavers capable of fighting modestly sized military engagements, true military engagements. And the largest of these fleets are each led by a Corsair prince, a gallant individual who maintains order, such as it is, and decides what sector to raid next or whether to temporarily enter the service of some well-paying alien benefactor rather than stealing that benefactor's property at the point of a blade. In the largest fleets, there are also sub-commanders called barons who communicate the will of the prince to the various pirate bands known as coteries that make up the armada. And the whole arrangement is, by its very nature, less disciplined than that of a Craftworld war host, because after all, the primary reason that Craftworlders become Corsairs to begin with is to escape that kind of rigidity. Now, you might be wondering why outcast elves would care about plunder or pay at all. After all, the craft worlds themselves can provide for all the material desires of those aboard, and they don't have market economies, despite having a path of the merchant, which I acknowledge is kind of bizarre, but they don't have market economies. And there are a few reasons for this. The first, I think, is that plunder is just a good time. And this is a personal theory, but I find myself wondering if many Aeldari Corsairs maybe think of economic gain when they are pirates as being a bit like the points that you or I would score during a game of Warhammer. Those points aren't fungible in the real world, but it sure is amusing to decide to care about them for the duration of the game. But another reason is that although some craft worlds provide refitting and resupply opportunities to Corsairs in exchange for information or other sorts of favors, for the most part, the Corsairs are kind of on their own. Material elves living in a material universe. And when they visit alien worlds, they need to have currency or trade goods to satisfy those material needs. So stuff is useful. You do your Corsairing in order that you can continue Corsairing. It's like Firefly. You just have to keep flying. Lastly, there are other sorts of prizes that have tremendous value even to craft worlders. Spirit stones, artifacts from the old empire, high-value prisoners that can be leveraged for other sorts of arrangements and information, just to name a few. Even in a post-scarcity society, there are still things that are scarce, that are valuable, that are not endlessly reproducible. But of course, the real reason that Aeldari Corsairs exist is that it's just a good time. I mean, who doesn't want to kind of like be a pirate? And because the Aeldari don't regard any other species as their spiritual, intellectual, or moral equals, many space elves have no qualms at all about using other sentient species as means to an end, murdering them when it serves a purpose, or just taking their stuff. Moreover, the Aeldari of the Corsair fleets get to engage in ostentatious displays of self-aggrandizement and indulgence that titillate their heightened emotional capacity, but might be regarded as poor manners on the craft worlds. Extravagant clothes, wild parties, duels to first blood, games of manhunt with actual mans. Anything goes as long as the prince doesn't veto it, and a prince who is too strict is likely to lose followers quickly unless she provides compensatory levels of plunder, excitement, and glory. Now, some of you may be wondering whether it's entirely safe for elves to have that much fun in a galaxy where Slaanesh exists, and the answer is, well, it depends on what you mean by safe, right? So someone recently asked in a 40K chat group that I belong to how anybody could have sex in the 41st millennia without inadvertently summoning Slaaneshi demons, but that is not how it works at all in 40K. Plenty of Imperial worlds are rife with prostitution and murder, but don't have any demons running around on them in real space. And just because Aeldari Corsairs might be pushing the limits of indulgence beyond what is acceptable on the craft worlds, it doesn't follow from that any of them are sprouting horns or getting grabbed by clawed hands from the other side of the mirror while they're adjusting their eyeshadow. They might be at a higher risk of being noticed and pursued by servants of Slaanesh in places where demons have already manifested. And there's no doubt that life in the Corsair fleets is more dangerous than life on craft worlds, but that, of course, is part of the appeal. Nevertheless, though, there are serious limits to the risks that even Corsairs are willing to accept, which relates to how they fight battles. So unlike craft worlders or Exodites, when Corsairs fight battles, it's not usually to combat some existential threat to their culture or species. Usually, they're just taking other people's stuff, which means most of them are not especially excited about the prospect of dying for the cause. So they favor a fast-moving, hit-and-run style of warfare, usually against hopelessly outclassed opponents, where they can be reasonably confident of taking few, if any, losses. They do, however, carry soul stones, just like craft worlders do. They are craft worlders, most of them, just in case. And sometimes they even fight alongside their craft world brethren in high-stakes battles, especially if the craft worlds are under threat. After all, most outcasts eventually return to their original craft worlds to take up the path again. Or if they're killed pirating, their soul stones are returned to their original craft worlds to join the Infinity Circuit. So all of them, all the Corsairs have a vested interest in protecting the world ships, even when they aren't currently living on one of the world ships. At least all of the Corsairs that originally hail from craft worlds. Not all of them do. Okay. However, there are a few outcasts that neither return home nor continue until death to indulge in the allure of piracy. There are a few that are instead seduced by the temptations of the Dark City and become members of the fourth major Aeldari faction, the Drukhari. The Drukhari in earlier editions of the game were called the Dark Eldar, which is frankly fitting. They are the unseelie counterparts to the craft worlders and the Exodites, and their single city, Commorragh, is arguably the last bastion of the old Aeldari Empire. In fact, the Drukhari refer to themselves as the true kin, contemptuously regarding craft worlders and Exodites as cowardly namby-pambies who quit the biker gang to either join the Amish or go hard on some newly fashionable self-help book called The Path, with a picture of a bored-ass white dude on the cover, intensely crocheting a mitten. At the moment Slaanesh was born, the original Aeldari civilization was completely obliterated with one exception: Commorragh. an ancient port city located in the webway itself that was arguably the most strategic location in the whole of the Old Dominion because it occupies the greatest nexus of interconnecting portals and the entirety of the Serpentine Labyrinth dimension, with passageways large enough to move entire fleets around. In fact, it was so critical that the ruling elite of the Old Empire decreed that the port city remain entirely independent to prevent any individual family from gaining a Dune-style monopoly on transportation. But this status also made Commorragh a hotbed of corruption and political intrigue. And remember how the webway is neither part of real space nor the warp? Well, that curious geographic fact means that the psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth never touched it. And when She Who Thirsts took her first breath, hoovering up the trillions of Eldari souls living in what is now the Eye of Terror, the pleasure cultists in the Dark City were spared, despite the fact that they were still leading the rock and roll lifestyle that led to the birth of Slaanesh to begin with. And since that time, the city has only grown, expanding into the spidery labyrinth of the webway to absorb other port cities and private estates until it became a black leviathan, probably far larger than even the largest imperial hive city. It might be the largest city in all of 40K. Because the physical laws of the webway are not the same as those of real space, the edifices of the Dark City can exist at impossible angles, making it seem to first-time visitors that the place has all the logic of a dream, impossible and baroque. And adding to the surreal quality is the fact that the ancient Eldari used a now lost technology to move several dying stars into the webway, that the port city might have a natural source of light and power. And those stars are sometimes called the Black Suns, and they bathe the entire metropolis in a Stygian red light. Another curious geographic fact is that because of the mechanics of the webway itself, locations in Commorragh that might only be a few hours apart on its own streets may border locations in real space that are many light years away from one another. So in real space, you may never be quite sure just how close or far the Dark City really is. Its looming spikes and hungry denizens might be just a stone's throw from the ancient grove on your backwater agri-world, where there are still legends of fey beings that come from the dark waters of a haunted lake to harvest children every 7 generations. Or maybe the closest trod to the spidery tendrils of Commorragh are several star systems away, right? You never know. And it matters because the Drukhari sustain themselves by abducting sentient beings in real space raids and torturing their captives in order to satiate a psychic hunger that they call the thirst. Unlike their Craftworld cousins, the Drukhari abhor psychers, and they let their own natural psychic gifts atrophy in order to avoid attracting the attention of Slaanesh, as all magic has its origins in the warp. But they nevertheless need to psychically absorb the fear and the misery of others in order to remain healthy and prevent themselves from aging. And unlike most sentient beings whose souls manifest in the warp as sources of light, Drukhari souls appear dark and twisted and perpetually degraded by the gnawing hunger of Slaanesh, who devours each of them gradually over the course of their lives and eventually consumes them entirely when they die the final death. Because not every death for them is the final death. We'll get to that. And this is another reason that the Drukhari avoid the inevitable for as long as possible by spiritually gorging on the suffering of the living, because they eventually get eaten by Slaanesh. As a result, Drukhari culture is centrally constructed around abduction, slavery, and also regular gladiatorial displays that enable thousands of spectators at once to feed off of the fear and pain of the combatants in these arenas. Their political system is comprised of a contrary network of hierarchical obligation, opportunistic self-interest, and bloody self-advancement rather than anything like meaningful rule of law. Although there is a single supreme overlord, as Drubael Vecht, Archon of the Cabal of the Black Heart, and he's a bit like an unseelie cross between the Emperor Augustus, Spartacus, and Marilyn Manson if they were all rolled into a single character in a sci-fi German fairy tale written by Ayn Rand. Vect was born a slave in Lower Camorra, and over a period of thousands of years rose to a position of supremacy through intrigue, bribery, and assassination, eventually overthrowing the old nobility that was left over from the fall. And under Vect, Camorra grew from an unruly port city with numerous satellite realms into a single dark metropolis capable of harnessing its collective power as a major player in the galaxy. Allegedly, the old political system of privilege based on birth has been swept away and replaced with a savage meritocracy in which the most cunning and cruel rise to positions of power until they are lethally removed by someone more fit. In reality, there are actually hundreds of sub-factions, each vying for power, each of which is made up of individuals jostling one another for authority within each individual subgroup. So it's just one big, nasty corporation of upwardly mobile psychopaths. Broadly speaking, there are three types of subfactions, though, which are the most notable. And these are cabals, witch cults, and homunculus covens. The cabals are pseudo-aristocratic warrior fraternities that occupy most of the best real estate in Camorra. The upper levels of its dark spires teem with hundreds of thousands of Cabalites whose power and authority stem largely from their control of the slave trade that is the lifeblood of the city. Without an endless supply of new captives to degrade, humiliate, terrify, and murder, the Drukhari would not endure for very long. And so this is how the Cabalites derive their authority, is controlling the slave trade. Each cabal is led by an archon who makes most of the important political and military decisions, and whose favor is one avenue by which an ambitious Cabalite may rise. Counter intrigue and eventual betrayal is, of course, another, right? Some of them, you don't ever become archon by doing what the previous archon said. And ironically, high-ranking members of cabals may have more to fear from upwardly mobile members of their own organizations than they do from rival fraternities, because an attack on any member of a cabal, no matter how junior in rank, is considered to be an attack on every individual member and can trigger catastrophic reprisals, like gang wars, basically, if those gangs were private armies. And it's through this system of threat and counter-threat that order, such as it is, persists amid the dark spires. And many of the most powerful cabals demonstrate their wealth and grow their reputations by becoming patrons of one of the witch cults, which comprise the second key segment of Drukhari society. So each witch cult is a gladiatorial sisterhood that maintains its own arena in which its members fight elaborate and lethal duels against exotic slaves. And the duels are public displays in which the witches dress as though for physical intimacy, treating murder and torture as a form of lovemaking, and the fights themselves are performative and acrobatic and drawn out so that thousands of viewers can physically feed on the fear and the suffering of the dying while taking exquisite delight in the aesthetics of the occasion. And it is in this way that the cabals and the witch cults provide the means by which the denizens of Camorra can slake their unnatural thirst without actually tearing one another to pieces, as their ancestors did during the fall of the Aeldari Empire. Now, although the witches are, no question, expert warriors, and they train for many years to hone their skills for the arena, their prowess is also enhanced through the use of combat stims and battle drugs that are crafted by the third segment of Drukhari society, the homunculus covens. The homunculi are flesh crafters and bioalchemists that were once the ruling elite of the old Aeldari Empire, which just makes the old Aeldari Empire extra creepy. It's a detail, I think, that was in the 8th Ed Codex. Very few homunculi remain, And those that there are haunt the labyrinthine tunnels that compose the lowest levels of Commorragh, crafting horrors that would make even the most debauched of corsairs sick to behold. Chambers of living flesh, slaves made from dozens of captives fused together into hulking mad brutes. And maybe also those hot dog finger people from Everything Everywhere All at Once. All manner of horrors, many of which serve their creators as everything from bodyguards to living decorations, haunt the private chambers of the homunculi. And many homunculi also modify their own bodies, growing additional limbs or tails, or making neat little meat sacks on their backs where they carry around their hearts and lungs like elementary school students with overstuffed Ninja Turtle backpacks. It's pretty gross. In exchange for fresh captives to use in their arts and crafts projects, the covens perform two of the most essential tasks to the ongoing survival of the Dark City. One, they artificially incubate and vat grow fertilized Aeldari embryos, a process that accounts for nearly the entire birth rate of Commorragh. There are also a few Commorragh who are born the old-fashioned way, but Aeldari have a really long gestational cycle, and also life in the Dark City is like so hard and violent that maybe pregnancy doesn't happen that much. We don't really know, but the ones who are born the old-fashioned way refer to themselves as trueborn and are kind of snobby about it. And the majority, which are grown in these vats, are like half this sort of like, I don't know, lesser caste, but not really, because they're also most of the population. It's supposed to be a meritocracy, remember, but nevertheless, the trueborn compose a sort of like pseudo aristocracy, I guess. The other thing that the homunculi do for the Drukhari is they resurrect the dead. Do you remember how She Who Thirsts eventually gulps down the black souls of each dead Drukhari like a party girl sucking down an espresso the morning after a rager? Well, it takes about a day or so after the death of a particular space elf to actually get sucked up by Slaanesh, and if the corpse of the dead Drukhari is carried back to Commorragh in time, a homunculus can usually revive the dead dark elf using a process of regeneration fueled by horrifically torturing another sentient being who's more or less strapped to the pod where the corpse is put and then sucked dry like a gelfling turned into a juice box by a Skeksis in the Dark Crystal. And that's how the world turns in the dark and twisted byways of 40K's most depraved city. To sum up, the Drukhari are, I think, serious contenders for the nastiest villains in all of 40K. I honestly think that even the Chaos Space Marine legions are more sympathetic than the psychopathic remnants of the worst excesses of the old space elf hegemony. They are, however, a really cool twist on the darkest aspects of Celtic and Northern European folklore, like hungry fey beings who abduct mortals and drag them off to a realm outside of space itself to become the tragic objects of amusement and supernatural horror. It's pretty cool, if seriously grimdark. Unsurprisingly, there is little love lost between the Craftworlders and their dark cousins, who are generally hated by the Asuryani. Not everywhere. Sometimes some Craftworlds are a little bit more open-minded about it, but for the most part, they're pretty unpopular. But they do occasionally work together when their interests align, and when this occurs, it is often with the diplomatic help of the fifth and final flavor of Aeldari, or maybe second to final, depending on how we think about it. But the fifth flavor is the Harlequins. Harlequins are followers of the only fully intact Aeldari deity, Kegarak, the laughing god, who escaped into the webway in order to survive the birth of Slaanesh. And exactly where the first Harlequins came from is a matter of some debate, as like so much 40K lore, different sources contradict each other. One story has it that in the centuries following the fall, individual Aeldari heard the call of Kegarak and followed his mysterious laughter into the webway, only to emerge later in mask and motley, utterly transformed from their former selves into the first disciples of the last of the gods, while other sources suggest that Harlequins predate the fall of the Empire, that when the old society was at its height, and maybe, or just the height of its decadence, maybe is the better way to put it. Worshippers of Kagarak formed troops of performers who attempted to provide perspective on the degradation of their culture through metaphorical dance and oration, but ultimately had to flee into the webway when their art was violently rejected by a civilization disinterested in being told to take it down a notch on the corn cob stuff, new and creative ways to use corn cobs. Whatever the case, Harlequins remain the most mysterious and enigmatic of all the major Eldari factions, and they may also be the smallest. They have no homeworlds, and their numbers are made up almost entirely of individual converts from among the Exodites, Asuryani, and Drukhari, who were moved to join one of the troops of traveling players that serve the inscrutable will of Kagarak and perform in all of these places where these other Eldari are. That said, becoming a Harlequin is not like running off to become a Corsair or joining the circus or whatever. It involves a profound ontological change that fundamentally alters the being who dons the mask, such that depending on which version of the lore you favor, either becoming a Harlequin completely erases the personality that existed previously, or it so profoundly alters the elf in question that while the old self might be in there somewhere still, it becomes a minority share of the new composite being. At the very least, becoming a Harlequin might be a bit like becoming an Exarch lost on the warrior path, but there's also the extreme possibility that it's more like what happens to the Chaos Space Marines when they allow demonic forces to overwrite their personalities and transform them into something quite new. There's no question that the Eldari gods are in some sense warp demons, so it stands to reason that the transformations would be related. And Harlequins are not only transformed mentally, but also physically, which would also make sense, becoming even faster and more graceful than aspect warriors. Whatever the case, an Eldar who becomes a Harlequin becomes entirely emotionally separated from old friends, loves, and allegiances, and is reforged as part of a family of players for whom the play is the every only thing and the performance is eternal. Collections of troops called masks travel freely between Craftworlds, the Dark City, and the Exodite planets, reminding their kin of their shared history, the tales of the gods, and most importantly, the fall, through elaborate dances in which each player assumes a role that for a time dominates their identity. Each Harlequin is a virtuoso of incredible skill, and their innate psychic connections enable them to act in concert with one another to create an overall aesthetic effect much greater than any of its component parts. Nevertheless, there are a few roles that are reserved only for a special few. Only death jesters are allowed to take on the role of death itself. And the solitaire plays the most terrifying part imaginable, that of the chaos god Slaanesh, which makes that particular elf the object of both respect and fear even among her own mask, and she plays no other role. All that said, the Harlequins are far more than just entertaining pseudo-historians benevolently reminding their kindred of important tales. They are living, breathing extensions of Kagarak's will. They are his agents in the material realm, teasing out his schemes both in the near term and the long term. And when they aren't engaged in performances, which, let's be clear, are by their very nature intentional manipulations of specific audiences, like the performances always have a purpose. We're trying to convince people of things. But when they're not engaged in performances, the various Harlequin masks are busy tricking and murdering their way to a better tomorrow, one in which space elf hegemony is restored, Slaanesh is finally defeated, and Kagarak gets the last laugh. There's actually a prophecy to this effect that is stating that eventually Kagarak will defeat Slaanesh, that is stored in the greatest repository of spooky truth anywhere in the entire 40K universe, and that is the Black Library, which is a secret Craftworld or Craftworld-like ship in the webway, maintained and guarded by the Harlequin masks. The spells, relics, and secrets stored in the Black Library could tip the balance of power entirely were they to fall into the wrong or perhaps the right hands, depending on your point of view. And there have been several times over the last 10,000 years leading up to M41 when the forces of chaos or the forces of the Imperium have tried to infiltrate the Black Library to achieve just that, but none of these have ended well for the would-be burglars. Having access to the Black Library, the fact that the Harlequins have access to the Black Library may also explain why, despite having no home world and no independent cultural origin, Harlequins have their own unique technologies and quite a few pieces of technology that are not present either in Camera or on the craft worlds. In battle, each Harlequin performer has a flip belt that allows them to perform impossible feats of athleticism and a suit that blurs their outline, making it difficult to discern exactly where they are. And some of their melee weapons are just crazy pants and wildly excel those of their Drukhari and Craftworld's cousins, at least in the lore, not always in the tabletop rules. One of these is the Harlequin's Caress, which creates a distortion field that enables the player wearing the Harlequin's Caress to simply reach her hand directly through the armored chestplate of an opponent and tear out his heart as though he was wide open on an autopsy table. For Harlequins, even combat is performative. It's just as dramatic and aestheticized as any dance, but it's a dance during which the performers never stop laughing, and their stylized masks read the thoughts of their adversaries and reflect back the stuff of their own most private nightmares. I actually think that from an experiential perspective, there is a strong argument for saying the Harlequins would be one of the most terrifying enemies in the 40K universe to have to face down. The detail about the masks is, I think, truly horrifying. If you think about what it would be like to face endlessly cackling assailants in motley, unable to really see exactly where they are, and when you can see them, they're just reflections of your worst nightmares. I mean, that's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. And Harlequins are also aided in battle by gifted psychers called Shadow Seers, who can further play upon an enemy's fears and cloud their senses. And much like Farseers, when Shadow Seers are not in combat, they're looking into the sands of time to see which grains will grow and which will not, that they might manipulate the harvest effectively. And also, like their Craftworld cousins, the meddling of Shadow Seers sometimes leads to enigmatic and seemingly contradictory behaviors on the part of the various masks. In the lore, for example, there's a Shadow Seer who betrayed the location of a Craftworld to the Emperor's children, which is like a pretty significant betrayal. The Emperor's children, for those of you who don't know, are the traitor Chaos Space Marine Legion most closely aligned with Slaanesh. And this Shadow Seer does this in order to bring about a change in leadership among the Chaos Space Marines that would ultimately be to the benefit of Space Elves everywhere, but it sure must have sucked for Craftworld Lugonoth in the short term. Harlequins might be welcome everywhere in Space Elf society, but this is sometimes simply because their contemporaries don't entirely realize what their clown cousins are really up to. They definitely have their own agenda. Okay, but let's go back to Kegrak for a moment. For all that he's a trickster god who is by his very nature a good time, he is arguably a much more demanding boss than even Esdrubael Vecht. Not even Vecht demands that his followers sacrifice their individuality and become consumed entirely by his agenda. So what exactly do Eldar who give themselves over to the god of laughter get in return? Perhaps most importantly, Kegrak has assured his disciples that he has it in his power to save their souls from Slaanesh after they die, with the possible exception of some of the solitaires for whom he allegedly does his absolute best but may not always be successful. As of yet, the lore has never established exactly how Kegrak's salvation works, but it must work, because he says it does, right? I can think of 3 or 4 possibilities as to what might be going on here. The first is that the dead followers of the Laughing God, in some sense, become part of the Laughing God after they die. That is, their soul energy is absorbed into his essence, and they may or may not retain their individuality, but even if they don't, it sure beats an eternity of consumption and torture by a bunch of crab-clawed pleasure demons wearing thongs. This is the one that seems the most likely to me, and I think makes the most sense given what the warp is, a total abstraction of energies that only have empirical properties because sentient beings impose those forms onto them. A second possibility is that Kagarak snatches the dead elf souls away from the Prince of Pleasure like a toddler stealing a biscuit and squirrels them away somewhere, most probably in the webway, because at this point in the 41st millennia, the warp seems to belong almost entirely to chaos. This one is a big maybe. It's certainly possible, but the souls would probably still need to be tethered to something physical if they're in the webway, like a spirit stone, which then makes the whole arrangement between Kagarak and his followers just seem a bit odd. You know, they don't wear spirit stones or anything, so exactly how does that work? Lastly, the god of laughter might just be having a laugh. He is a trickster god, after all, and I actually think it would be both tragic and hilarious if the whole, no, I am going to save you from Slaanesh after you die gambit is all some elaborate equivocation whereby dead Harlequins do get munched by Slaanesh, and Kagarak just figures that if his long game comes to fruition and all the Aeldari souls get set free when She Who Thirsts is destroyed, he will have made good on his promise to deliver his followers from her big bad sodomistic embrace. Classic C, am I right? But to be fair, that's just kind of my own pet fan theory, and it's, I think, perhaps at this point, the least likely one in the lore. But allegedly, somehow, he saves their souls. Okay, so speaking of gods, there is one last Aeldari pseudo-faction that we haven't really talked about, the Ynnari. The Ynnari are, like the Harlequins, in that they are essentially a religious sect made up of converts from other factions. But unlike the Harlequins, they've not been transformed in body and mind. And in fact, they're a bit more like a political party made up of Corsairs, Craftworlders, Drukhari, and even some Harlequins who all have in common allegiance to Yvraine, the daughter of Shades, and self-styled emissary of Ynnari, Ennead, perhaps. Some of the pronunciations in 40K are vague at best, and no matter what you say, somebody will always correct you. Sort of like in New England, if you order a wrapped lamb kebab anywhere, I've been doing this experiment for years, you can say to a waiter, like, I'd like the gyro, and they'll say, sure, one hero. And if you say I'd like a hero, they'll say, yes, one gyro, coming right up. I suspect with that one, there is a right answer. But in any event, Ynnari is the Aeldari god of the dead, whom Yvraine's followers believe will eventually have the power to destroy Slaanesh. They also believe that if they die fighting in Yvraine's service, they will not be consumed by Slaanesh, but will instead become part of this new death god until chaos is defeated. Now, I know what you're thinking. Brent, you distinctly told us that Kagarak, Kane, and maybe Isha were the only members of the Pantheon to survive the birth of Slaanesh. So what's this business about a fourth god? There was no Ennead when the fall occurred. Ennead is new. Remember how back at the beginning of this video, I talked about how the Aeldari were created by the Old Ones as a psychically gifted species capable of fighting the Catan and the Necrons? And remember how the Aeldari gods were most likely created in these early days by the collective psychic resonance and the warp of this nascent race of super psychers? Well, that's not the only time the Aeldari created a god. They did it again inadvertently when they brought Slaanesh into being by partying too enthusiastically, and they might have done it a third time simply by dying a lot. Furthermore, there's overwhelming evidence that there is something coalescing in the Immaterium that seems to be composed of Aeldari souls, and that something has great power that responds to Yvraine, who also rather publicly rose from the dead after being obviously killed in one of the arenas on Camorra. And the fact is that Yvraine seems to be able to literally summon an avatar of this new god to fight on her behalf when the body count gets high enough to make the magic possible. She also has other never-before-seen psychic abilities, some of which she used to help restore the Space Marine Primarch Reboot Gilliman from his 10,000-year death-like torpor because the seers have determined that his return is essential for the final battle against chaos. And now there are all of these memes about how she's his girlfriend, which is not really a thing in the lore, but is very funny. Furthermore, there are prophecies that seem to support the possibility that Yvraine is right about everything. And space elves do love their prophecies. Perhaps the most famous of these is the Ranadandra, the foretold epic final battle against chaos in which everyone dies, but maybe, just maybe, so does Slaanesh. And some of the most influential space elf seers in the galaxy are convinced that the apotheosis of Ynnari will be the instrument of that Pyrrhic victory, which will then be followed by all of the lost Aeldari souls returning to the cycle of immortal rebirth that they enjoyed before the fall, but this time in a galaxy scourged clean of the great enemy. As hopeful as all of this sounds, there are some reasons to doubt, and many do. In fact, there is nothing, I think, as divisive for the Aeldari in the current moment of the 40K timeline as the question of who and what the Ynnari really are. For one thing, the incarnation of the still forming alleged Aeldari god of death, bears an uncanny and disturbing similarity to a demon of Slaanesh. It's a lithe, androgynous, purpley pink murder monster with horns, and it incarnated for the first time when Baal Tan, one of the most powerful Craftworlds, was fractured by an invasion of Slaaneshi demons. Another concern is that Yvraine asks her followers to do the very thing that Slaanesh would have wanted them to do before there was a Yvraine at all. Stop wearing spirit stones or relying on world spirits or Kagarak and fight aggressively without fear of death. Many Ynnari don't even wear helmets when they fight for this reason. Lastly, it all just seems a bit too good to be true. And Slaanesh is crafty AF, so it just smells fishy. Plenty of Aeldari from each of the factions represented in Yvraine's retinue, so the Drukhari, the Corsairs, the Harlequins, the Craftworlders, the Exodites presumably, think that it's much more likely that Yvraine and the Incarn have been tainted in some way by the very powers that Yvraine claims she's dedicated to destroying, than that she is in fact some doom prophetess savior that's going to deliver them all from the Prince of Pleasure by getting them all killed without any spirit stones or obelisks or interference from Kagarak to stand between their souls and an eternity of demonic BDSM. I love this kind of ambiguity in the 40K lore, and I really hope that Games Workshop resists the inclination to move this particular storyline forward in a way that shuts down one possibility or the other with reference to the true nature of the newest Aeldari god. I think one of the things that makes 40K lore a little bit unique is that it operates more as a vast and ambiguous sandbox of possibility than a single clear and coherent timeline. That said, it does seem to me that over the course of the last two editions, the writers have been leaning in favor of Yvraine's version of what the Ynnari are being more or less accurate. At the very least, I think it's obvious at this point that she believes what she's saying. And she would be as surprised as anyone to discover that she's been a pawn of Slaanesh the whole time. That seems increasingly unlikely. But I do think the possibility that there is something wrong with Ynnari and maybe also, its incarnation, the Incarn, like maybe it is not really what it was originally meant to be. I think that's still strongly present in the lore as a possibility. I think it definitely started out being an incarnation of a new Aeldari god, but maybe it is tainted in some way. I think there's still some ambiguity around that. There's a great deal more that I could say about the Ynnari, but it's a bit too plot-based and specific for the purposes of this video. I didn't get to talk about Yvraine's bodyguard, the Vizark, who I like to call Casey Jones, because he just follows her around like that character from the Ninja Turtles, never taking his mask off and never really saying very much. And her backstory is cool. But really, this video is about providing a broad overview of who and what space elves are in the wild world of the 41st millennium, which I think we've more or less accomplished, and this is already pretty long. So I'm gonna leave it there. If you're a player new to 40K, interested in possibly collecting Eldar, I hope that you found some of the information here interesting and exciting because I love when people decide they want to collect Space Elves. They're my favorite faction. If that's you, you might also check out my video from a few months ago about how 10th edition Space Elves play on the table. If you're just a 40k lore junkie or a fan of the video game seeking to understand more about one of the coolest and most complicated IPs in all of geekdom, then you might also enjoy the videos that I linked in the description, as well as the one I made a while back about where to start with Black Library novels. And if you're just a loyal fan of the channel, thanks for listening to a bunch of lore that you probably already know. I really appreciate more than you know those of you who are just along for the ride, who listen to all my stuff, even if you already know the thing. You guys are awesome. It's really nice. If you have your own ideas about what aspects of Space Elf lore are most interesting, bizarre, or overlooked, please leave those in the comments below. I'm not really interested in arguing about the pronunciation of some name or something, because so if you could just I don't know, say something else, that would be amazing. You could also just say hi, which helps out the algorithm, or clicking like and subscribing also helps. Oh man, it feels so cheap and TikTok-y to say that, but this is the world we live in. Those of you who want to obtain early access to some content or connect more personally with me and a community of like-minded elf enthusiasts over on Discord might consider becoming patrons at $3 a month, which I will also link in the video description. This channel has really grown from a lark into an almost pseudo part-time job, and I hugely appreciate the patrons and my sponsor, the Magnet Baron, who have enabled me to continue doing this long after I would have otherwise thrown in the towel. You're amazing. You should also, those of you who are listening, feel free to link related lore videos by other content creators in the comments below. I'm not jealous, and there are a number of people making excellent content, and if you enjoy mine, you'll probably enjoy theirs. I'm especially a fan of Luton09, who is, I think, a full-time professional Warhammer lore video creator, because at some point you can get away with that when your videos are pulling down hundreds of thousands or millions of views. What a weird timeline this is, in which that's a job. Okay, I hope to be back again soon with something new. The next big lore video on selecting a craft world will probably have to wait until I've dropped a few other shorter ones, but I promise that that's in the not too distant future. And you're also always welcome to share with me in the comments below what other kinds of content you'd like to see. And until then, best wishes and good luck in your next campaign. Take care.